Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Tizengauzen. Today is September 5th, and we have a lot of interesting news. In this episode, Russians are a bit shocked. Putin has told them that Russia is facing a gas shortage. To be more precise, it's already starting. So it turns out that this winter, it won't be Europe freezing, but Russia. And Trump is demanding that Europe stop buying Russian oil. Jong Un is terribly afraid of spies and wipes down every chair and armchair after himself. After events in Beijing, meanwhile, the US is winding down aid programs for countries bordering Russia. Anxiety is growing in Europe, and Putin admitted that he can no longer come to an agreement with Zelensky. All this and more. Today's episode will have a lot of interesting things, so if you're new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. Let's start with some news that will probably shock Russians the most. Russia is facing a gas shortage. Vladimir Putin himself officially announced this at the Eastern Economic Forum, held in the city of Vladivostok. I quote, "We are facing a gas shortage," he emphasized. He also said that the energy infrastructure of the Far East is insufficiently connected, and the grid system there needs development. Putin also noted that signs of a gas shortage are already being observed specifically in the Far East, where some organizations are already facing difficulties in supplying their enterprises with gas. And do you know what he proposed to compensate for the possible gas shortage? A rapid switch to coal. According to Putin, the coal reserves will last for hundreds of years, so he says, let's switch to coal. And according to Putin, coal can be used much more efficiently. I wonder who told him that. Also, back in June, the Ministry of Energy of the Russian Federation predicted a 42% gas shortage in the Far East. That's almost half of the total volume, just a little bit short. How did it come to this anyway? So, can anyone explain how this happened? And now, here's the most interesting part, probably the most interesting. Russia has agreed to increase gas exports to China. In other words, while there's not enough for its own people, it will increase exports to China by 6 billion cubic meters. And in addition, deliveries along the Sakhalin Far East China route are planned to reach another 12 billion cubic meters. So, through that Far East, Sakhalin Far East China, this pipeline that Putin announced, he basically said, soon half of your gas will be gone. In other words, to fix the situation, Putin and Russia need to develop the domestic gas transportation network, but they don't want to. Or rather, why bother? Those without gas can just heat their homes with firewood somehow. As for China, well, yes, of course. He sent our gas to our comrades over there in the east. That's the extent of Putin's relationships. Chinese comrades are supplied with gas, but Russian citizens, sorry, have to heat with coal or whatever else they can find. You know, some even burn those pressed dung cakes for heating. So basically, dear Russians, says Putin, switch to firewood, kindling, coal, roots, and birch bark. Well, it makes perfect sense, especially in light of recent events, shutting off mobile internet, blocking Western resources. In other words, Putin has brought back the Soviet Union just as he wanted and has reversed the technological revolution, moving it backwards. Well then, and at this point, an ancient evil awoke, or rather sobered up. Medvedev threatened to seize more Ukrainian territory in response to aid to Kiev at the expense of Russian assets. Russia, quoting Medvedev, Russia will seize new territories of Ukraine in order to recoup in kind the income from frozen assets in the West that Western countries are transferring to Kiev. And he commented on the recent event where the UK sent Ukraine 1.3 billion received as profit from the use of Russian assets. Let me remind you, Russian assets are frozen. They are transferring to us the interest that has accrued on these frozen assets, while the assets themselves have not yet been touched. So, Medvedev said the following: Britain has committed an offense, and Russia has, as lawyers say, the right to make claims against it and against the current Banderite Ukraine. But given that, for obvious reasons, it is impossible to recover this money through the courts, we will be reclaiming value in kind, that is, with Ukrainian land or other movable and immovable property located on that land. So Medvedev, the would-be invader, can't even seize a kiosk selling cheap liquor, yet here he is making such threats. I suppose he probably even bought himself an invader's uniform at a children's store somewhere. At the same time, he added that Moscow could seize British Crown valuables, including those located in Russia. I wonder what kind of British Crown valuables those are. Most likely he means some remaining property of British companies and possibly diplomatic property, consulate buildings, the ambassador's residence, and so on. But you know what surprised me once again, just really surprised me? If Britain is causing you so much suffering and your assets have been frozen and the interest is being transferred somewhere to someone, then why don't you seize British territory? Explain this to me. How does that make sense? Or Putin, who says that the West is dragging Ukraine into NATO, so that's why he attacked Ukraine. Not NATO, not the West. So if for them the main evil is the West, the USA, NATO, the European Union, then why aren't they fighting them? The answer is obvious. They're afraid. Look, in the Baltic countries, by the way, let me take this opportunity to send a huge greeting and express my gratitude for the support to Ukraine, to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and all the other countries that are helping Ukraine. Thank you so much. We truly appreciate it. So in the Baltic countries, no one bothers to be polite with fans of the Russian world. They're thrown out by the scruff of the neck in droves, sent back to Russia where they actually belong. If you want to love Putin, go love him there, in your homeland. There's no need to shout Putin is great somewhere in Latvia, and no need to run around there with Russian flags. Russia is a terrorist country, an aggressor. Want to support Russia? Go back home, Valeria. So in the Baltic countries, they do what Russia calls oppressing Russian speakers. But for some reason, Putin invaded Donbass to save some so-called Russian speakers there. Yet he's in no hurry to invade anywhere else where other Russian speakers are supposedly oppressed. Well, in Donbass, let me remind you, he saved the residents of Donbass, except he took away their former normal lives. Now they get water once a week and everything is in ruins. And here's the question. Why doesn't he attack other countries? The answer is very simple. If we're talking about the Baltic countries, for example, it's because they are members of NATO. Russians can threaten anyone they want, but they will never attack someone they consider, well, at least equal to themselves in strength. Just look at whom Russia has fought in recent times. Chechnya, and in fact they didn't win the first war in Chechnya. They had to resort to trickery, deception, then to terrorist attacks and provocations and so on. Georgia, Ukraine. They thought this war would also be an easy walk for them. I think that after the parade in Beijing, where Putin saw with his own eyes weapons that Russia will never have, when the whole world saw just how technologically behind Russia's military-industrial complex is compared to China. And on top of that, Putin has been bogged down in the war with Ukraine for 4 years now. If China decides, let's say, to occupy a bit of Siberia and the Far East, where there will soon be a serious gas shortage, no one there will even make a sound. In fact, I get the feeling that people there would come out with flags to welcome Comrade Xi's army. Medvedev would be there in a kokoshnik, jumping around with bread and salt, bowing to everyone. I guarantee you that. Putin is even teaching his younger offspring Chinese. Honestly, I'm still under the impression from that conversation. I'm remembering Beijing now, that parade. I'm still struck by that conversation, how Putin, he was practically breathless. They were talking with Xi Jinping about some kind of eternal life. And Putin, even his dead eyes seemed to light up. He even started to bounce with excitement. Soon, organs will be able to be transplanted endlessly. It'll be possible to live forever. She echoed him saying, yes, in this century we'll live to 150. Their main topic was basically how to live as long as possible. I get it. After 70, that's probably the thing that worries you most. Then just let go of power. Stop destroying neighboring countries, your own country. Stop killing people. Stop clinging to power with those gnarled elderly fingers. And now you just don't know what to do anymore. How many people do you have to drown in blood? I don't know, maybe it's some kind of deal with the devil. This Putin has made some kind of pact that he needs to destroy a certain number of millions, and then his youth will somehow be prolonged somewhere. They'll bring him some rejuvenating apples. Some kind, I don't even know. So far, they're only stuffing them in his cheeks. I mean, just enjoy your life, at least in old age, play with your grandchildren. But no, for a dictator, losing power is the same as death. That's why most likely he'll only be carried out of the Kremlin feet first and probably straight to the mausoleum. They'll throw out the previous Lenin and put him in there instead. And I'd like to recall some absolutely spot-on words that I came across in the context of what Russia is doing today, and not just today. Russia is an empire that doesn't know how to live without war. If it doesn't have an enemy, it creates one. If there are no external threats, it starts looking for them within. This curse has lasted for centuries. These are the words of Valeria Ilyinichna Novodvorskaya, now deceased, whose death, in fact, the Putin regime was also involved in. Well, let me remind you why. It didn't turn out to be a walk in the park. For Putin, this is a war, and Kiev wasn't taken in 3 days or 4 days or even in 3 years, because the Ukrainian people showed the whole world what resistance means, what it means to fight for your independence and freedom, and they continue to do so to this day. That's why, friends, I want to remind you about an important fundraiser for the separate Bohdan Khmelnytsky brigade, which is currently fighting in the Pokrovsk direction. I ask you to support this fundraiser. Our help is extremely needed right now. For our soldiers, the link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video and also in the comments. There's private, there's mono, and there's PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. I see everyone, and I want to say a huge thank you to all of you. And if you're not on my channel, just scan the QR code. It leads directly to the fundraiser. Your 50 or 100 hryvnias could save a life. Remember, this is for transport, which is what we're raising funds for right now. It can not only effectively carry out combat missions and help accomplish these tasks, but also save the lives of our soldiers. So let's support this fundraiser, and in return, our heroes won't let the Russians advance any further. And by the way, friends, here's a thank you from our combat medics from the 1st Separate Medical Battalion, for whom, thanks to you, we managed to raise... We started raising funds for 1 ground evacuation drone, the unmanned mole, but ended up raising enough for 2. So, here's this thank you, this video. Take a look.
Because of Russian drones, evacuating the wounded is now one of the most difficult tasks on the front line. That's why it's so important to have the capability to evacuate using unmanned systems. We are the unmanned systems company of the 1st Separate Medical Battalion. We thank Boris Tizengauzen and the viewers of his channel for 700,000 UAH. These funds were raised for the mall ground robotic complexes for evacuating the wounded. Your support gives us the tools to operate in situations where there are no other means available. Your help can save lives. Thank you.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Now, in every life of our heroes that will be saved thanks to these ground-based systems, there will be your contribution. For that, you have my deepest gratitude. At an online conference of the Coalition of the Willing, Trump advised the European Union to stop buying oil from Russia. Absolutely right. Actually, as for me, the name doesn't sound very energetic. Coalition of the Willing or something like that. Well, anyway, that's just naming. So, absolutely, I agree with Trump on this. He joined the online conference of the Coalition of the Willing, which, let me remind you, is headed by President Macron. And Donald Trump emphasized that Europe should stop buying Russian oil, which is used to finance the war, because, as Trump said, Russia received more than €1 billion from the EU in just 1 year from fuel sales. By the way, the US also buys processed Russian oil in the form of petroleum products from Indian refineries. So, in general, everyone here is involved. But do you know why I specifically included this news in this episode? Because essentially, who was this criticism directed at? Who in Europe is buying Russian oil? There are 2 key countries, Hungary and Slovakia. And let me remind you, Orbán positioned himself as a great friend of Trump. And now Trump will come, set things straight, and show you how it's done. And here Trump is saying directly, stop buying Russian oil. Moreover, Orbán and Fico have been fiercely arguing lately over the attacks on the Druzhba pipeline, claiming it's an assault on their energy independence, or rather on their dependence on Russia, to be more accurate. And this is what they've been stirring up recently. And now it turns out that Ukraine is doing exactly what Donald Trump is asking for. Well, we have our own kind of sanctions. In other words, while the European bureaucracy is still putting together a sanctions package, drones from the GUR, the SBU, and the armed forces of Ukraine are already quickly implementing those sanctions by blowing up the Druzhba pipeline. So I'm curious, what will Orban say in response now? What is he going to broadcast now? They'll tell him, actually, this is always something the opposition can use, as they say, a tip for the housewives, a tip for the Hungarian opposition. It's a very effective lever of influence on Orban. What, you don't agree with Trump? That's not good. Well, regarding the purchase of oil and oil products from Russia, so what do you think? Did the Netherlands and Greece, for example, know that by buying oil products from Georgia, they were theoretically buying Russian oil products? Let's do this. Let's add some variables to this complicated equation. Oil is refined into oil products, diesel, gasoline, kerosene, and so on. There are no oil refineries in Georgia, meaning there's nothing to process the oil with. So where do these oil products come from and whose are they? So let's add this in. It's a complicated issue. Now, did the Netherlands and Greece know they were buying Russian products repackaged with new documents? I think at the very least they suspected it. Turkey is guilty of this as well. Russian oil and oil products are brought into Turkey, let me remind you, processed at local refineries, and then either transshipped or simply transferred in Turkish ports. So, after being transferred, the products are sent on to Europe already, with a Turkish certificate. That's why, in this context, if Mr. Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, who has close ties with Mr. Erdogan, has the opportunity, his help would be invaluable in the context of a sharp conflict with Russia to discuss this topic with Mr. Erdogan. I understand that they are in different weight categories. I understand that Turkey has its own economic interests, but I think that a bit of pressure, some gentle pushing from different sides could have an effect. By the way, I'd like to remind you that until January 26th, when the 18th package of European Union sanctions is set to take effect, it will still be possible to purchase petroleum products made from processed Russian oil. After January 26th, that's it, because this provision is included in the 18th package. Any product made from Russian oil, even if it's been processed in India or Turkey, will be considered Russian. You might say it's too late, not until next year. I agree with you. By the way, there's another thing that struck me at this summit in Beijing. I came across a video showing how Kim Jong Un's security team meticulously erased any trace of his presence. They wiped down the chair he sat on while talking with Putin, and took away every item he had touched. So basically, right after the meeting with Putin, they started doing this, and they didn't care at all about the cameras filming them. They just wiped everything down like that. And let me remind you, this protocol has been in place since Kim Jong Un's father. They used to wipe everything down after him as well, and after his grandfather too, because there were rumors that they also had body doubles. In general, this is a completely standard thing for dictators. That is, it has been proven that Stalin had body doubles and not just him. So when there's a war going on, when there might be an assassination attempt, even General Montgomery had his own double to mislead German intelligence. But for modern dictators, this is just the norm, yes. And the secrecy around information about their health is the same thing, because they decided to remove all traces of Kim Jong-un's DNA from every surface. It's a real panic, a fear that someone might find out what's going on with his health. Yeah, I regularly see him puffing on a cigarette in all the footage. It's obvious that, in my opinion, Kim Jong-un is the only overweight person in North Korea. I haven't seen anyone else. No matter how many videos I've watched, there aren't any other overweight people there. So it's a panic-level fear. What could they possibly find out from a hair? How many burgers he ate for breakfast? Or how many bottles of Cristal champagne he drank on his armored train? Yeah. Well, Putin has his own story there too. He has an entire choir that goes on tour, especially I think during tough, difficult trips to far-off regions. For example, the Far East, or those trips where they show that Putin supposedly even goes out, there, closer to the front line. But he's already a coward. Pardon my French? Where is he even going? Come on, please. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It helps with promotion. And look at us now, almost 450,000 viewers. Honestly, when I started this channel a year and a half ago, I never thought it would turn out like this. By the way, the English language channel has also started to grow somehow. There are already 2,000 subscribers there, so videos are just being added there and it's somehow moving along. And that's good. We'll also be focusing on the English language channel. The US is winding down its defense aid programs for countries that border Russia. So, what is this about? The Financial Times reports this, citing Pentagon officials. By the way, Trump seriously wants to rename the Pentagon to the Ministry of War. They're waiting for a decision now because it will have to go through Congress. Yes, so soon we might be saying, as reported by the American Ministry of War. Yes. So, regarding the reduction of this funding for countries bordering Russia from 2018 to 2022, 1.6 billion was spent on the military aid program in Europe for countries bordering Russia. And, well, that's significant. The key recipients were Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as I already mentioned. But look, the logic here, let's put it this way. The financial logic of the Trump administration was, let them pay for their own security. And the US won't pay more for others anymore. Moreover, Trump's rather aggressive policy of increasing defense spending has produced results. Look, European countries have started spending a record amount of money on their own defense. In other words, the financial logic is flawless, America-centric. However, if the whole world were guided solely by financial logic, then Putin wouldn't have started this war. That is, he wouldn't have destroyed foreign markets, wouldn't have ended up under sanctions, and wouldn't be facing a colossal hole in his budget today amounting to several trillion. In other words, if it were purely financial logic, and now this logic of every man for himself, which is economically justified, is completely unjustified politically. Because in fact, the opponents of the civilized world, many of whom gathered in Beijing at that parade I mentioned, these opponents of the civilized world act differently. They act according to the principle, one for all and all for one. China, even under the risk of sanctions and already under sanctions, continues to supply Putin with the necessary components and continues to save his economy. In general, if the Allies had lived by the principle of every man for himself or only economic expediency, World War II would have ended very differently. While this axis of evil is being cemented and unified, the Western world is becoming increasingly divided. Moreover, the key player of the West, the United States, represented by Donald Trump, is ready to trade even with the devil himself. That is, if we're talking about Putin, it's the same thing. Meanwhile, China is declaring the creation of a world-class army. And Donald Trump is ready to trade with whoever offers more. Right there, just beyond your fence, the enemy is preparing for World War III. They are signing strategic agreements with each other, strengthening each other's economies, starting these cross-supplies of components, building weapons factories, in North Korea for Russia, in Russia for North Korea, and so on. They are getting ready. And here they're ready to trade because someone might offer more. They're ready to do business even with those who are building a big army and preparing for a big war against you. The narrow-minded logic of focusing solely on short-term profit, completely devoid of any comprehensive long-term strategy or meticulous planning, is unequivocally disastrous. I just vividly imagined, following this very same flawed logic, how during the tumultuous period of World War II, a figure like Hitler might conceivably say, "My dear comrades, I will generously pay you significantly more for the vital Lend-Lease assistance provided to the Soviet Union. Send the planes here, send the tanks here, bring everything here. I'll pay more. I've got gold, I've occupied territories, looted, and I'm paying in gold." And what are our allies supposed to do? Of course, the British and Americans, take it. Can you imagine how that would have ended if it had been just business? And these strange relations we have with Putin? We get along great, even though I know, or rather Donald Trump writes, that you in Beijing are planning a conspiracy against the US, Russia, North Korea, China. With Putin, he still keeps saying the relationship is excellent. It's all very simple. You understand who your main enemy is, who's in the same club with him, who's on his side. Sometimes it all seems like some kind of childish grudges. Like, you and I are best buddies, we'll beat everyone. Just don't be friends with Sergei from the third entrance. That's what it looks like. It really reminded me of something, a scene from a movie. There are scenes like that in many movies, but this one in particular came to mind, as if it were about Trump and Putin. Here the movie was called 21 Jump Street. Actually, it's an adaptation, a remake of the popular 1980s TV series 21 Jump Street. So there was a moment where young undercover cops go to a high school pretending to be students in order to expose some criminals. And there's a scene where one of them, well, their buddies like, yo, we're cops, we're gonna become real cool guys. That whole vibe. And there's a moment where one of these cops actually starts to become friends with some of the high school football players because he's also a big guy. Go ahead. And the other one starts reminiscing about how they used to run and catch criminals. It kind of feels like that's what this is about. Donald Trump, you and I are walking hand in hand with Putin, the whole world. Oh, you bastard. So you're shaking hands with Xi Jinping at the parade in Beijing. That's the feeling I get. Our favorite segment, Call the Orderlies. The Kremlin stated that other countries will ask for sanctions to be imposed on themselves because of the positive impact restrictions have had on Russia. In other words, Russia is showing how sanctions, it's flourishing under sanctions, and other countries will say, oh, give us sanctions too. We want to flourish like Russia. This is not a joke at all. This was stated by Maxim Oreshkin, deputy head of President Putin's administration. There in Vladivostok as well, if I remember correctly. Yes. So every time I recall this thorny path of Russian rhetoric from the very first days of the sanctions, don't make our Iskandars laugh. Sanctions only make things better for us. And then even Lavrov himself, draconian sanctions. By the way, one of Russia's main demands is to lift the sanctions at least partially. Why? If, after all, an entire official figure is declaring that Russia is flourishing, and do you know who he was addressing this to? I quote, I think that the realization of this positive, beneficial effect of sanctions and trade restrictions is something that major economies like China and India will soon begin to experience themselves. I think that over time, every country in the global majority will be asking for sanctions to be imposed against them. And who gave this character internet access in the ward? I'm asking you. Well, although, what am I surprised about? After all, we've already heard from Putin that he wouldn't attack Ukraine, that he didn't need Crimea, that there were no troops in Donbass, and so on. Well, why wouldn't Putin's inner circle lie one more time? And by the way, Putin is now openly telling Donald Trump that he won't sign anything with Zelensky. Hello, Donald Trump? What did Putin say? He said that he wouldn't be able to reach an agreement with Zelensky to end the war. A quote again from the Eastern Economic Forum. Russia will not be able to reach an agreement to end the war with the president of Ukraine, Putin said. I've said many times already that I'm ready for these contacts. I don't see much point in it. Why? Because it will be practically impossible to reach an agreement with the Ukrainian side on key issues. Even if there is political will, which I doubt, there are legal and technical difficulties, Putin said. And according to him, any agreements with Kiev regarding the territories seized by the Russian army must be confirmed by a referendum, as required by the Constitution of Ukraine. And to organize a referendum, martial law needs to be lifted and so on and so forth. And afterwards, elections must be held immediately. In general, Putin said that regardless of the results, a corresponding decision from the Constitutional Court would be required. But in his opinion, the court does not function. And in general, Zelensky is not legitimate. Donald Trump. How many more days can be given to Putin after this statement, when he openly says that he will not negotiate about anything? And yet he is concerned about some legal nuances, meaning instead of just withdrawing the troops from here and running off to his swamp to try to fix his life there. No, that doesn't work. Some legal issues are bothering a terrorist who has openly spat on international law, the UN Charter, and Ukraine's recognized borders. He's worried about some legal nuances. Can you imagine? Every day he launches missiles and drones at the territory of another independent state, kills civilians, kidnaps Ukrainian children, has received an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, and yet he's concerned about some legal nuances and details. Well, here they showed how it should be done. I'm glad that sometimes, unfortunately only sometimes, we hear reasonable voices and see examples of how to deal with maniacs properly. The European Commissioner for Energy has called for a permanent rejection of Russian resources. Dan Jurgensen stated that even after the war ends, Europe should not return to importing Russian energy resources. That's right. This topic could become one of the key items on today's agenda, today's task. That's right, because Russia will not end the war. As I quoted Valeria Ilyinichna, Russia always invents an external enemy and will always be at war with it. Therefore, deprive it of income, as they say, make Russia small again, make it smaller, release it from the prison of nations, and those peoples who are there as second or third class citizens, the impoverished republics, let them go. Reduce it to such a size that Russia can no longer pose a threat to the civilized world. And of course, remove the sting in the form of nuclear weapons. Give them some kind of Budapest memorandum after they become that small, and that's it. That would be the right thing to do. And you, friends, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Be sure to subscribe to this channel. I ask you, let's support the fundraiser for our soldiers. It's very difficult for them right now and they need our help. Wishing us all a peaceful day. And of course, glory to Ukraine.